upper limb, we are doing all muscles on the right-hand side. We have the biceps brachii, which flexes and supinates the forearm, and the origin is the scapula, anterior and posteriorly, and the insertion is the radius. Next is the brachialis, and this muscle flexes the arm at the elbow. The origin is the humerus, and the insertion is the ulna. Then we'll spin around and go posteriorly to the triceps brachii. This is an extension at the elbow, and origin is the scapula and the humerus. The insertion is the ulnar olecranon. Next, we have the brachioradialis on the right, and this flexes the arm at the elbow. It's a synergist to the brachialis, and the origin is the humerus, and the insertion is the radius. Next is the pronator teres on the right-hand side. This muscle pronates the hand and forearm. The origin is the humeral, medial epicondyle, and ulnar coronoid process. The insertion is the ulnar olecranon. Muscles of the forearm, the flexor carpi radialis on the right-hand side has the action of hand abduction and flexion. The origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and the insertion is the metacarpals 2 through 3. Next is the palmaris longus. On the right-hand side, this is a weak muscle. The origin is on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The insertion is the palmar aponeurosis. Next is the flexor digitorum superficialis, which is this muscle here. This is the flexor of the fingers. The origin is the humeral, medial epicondyle, and the ulnar coronoid process and the radius. The insertion is the middle phalanges, fingers 2 through 5. Next is the flexor pollicis longus. And this muscle is the long flexor of the thumb. The origin is the radius in the interosseous membrane. The insertion is the distal phalanx of the thumb. Just deep to the palmaris longus is the flexor digitorum profundus on the right. The deep flexor of the fingers 2 through 5, and its origin is the ulna and interosseous membrane. The insertion is the distal phalanges 2 through 5. Next is the pronator quadratus. This pronates the hand and forearm. The origin is the anterior distal end of the ulna, and the insertion is the distal end of the radius. And then lastly, on this little muscle here is the flexor carpi ulnaris, and this muscle is in charge of hand adduction and flexion, and the origin is the ulna olecranon and the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The insertion is the hamate, pisiform, and metacarpal 5. All right, for the posterior muscles, we have the extensor carpi radialis longus on the right, and this abduct and extends the wrist. The origin is the lateral side of the humerus, and the insertion is the second metacarpal. Next is the extensor carpi radialis brevis on the right. This extends and abducts the wrist. The origin is the humeral lateral epicondyle, and the insertion is the third metacarpal. Next is the extensor digitorum on the right. This is in charge of finger extending. The origin is the lateral humeral epicondyle, and the insertion is phalanges 2 through 5. Here is the supinator. This is the antagonist that supinates the forearm. The origin is the ulna and lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and the insertion is the radius. And then more posterior is the extensor digiti minimi. This is the pinky finger extender. The origin is the humeral lateral epicondyle, and the insertion is the proximal phalanx of 5. And then the extensor carpi ulnaris. extends the hand and adducts. The origin is the humeral lateral epicondyle and posterior ulna. The insertion is the fifth metacarpal. Deep is the ansones on the right. This extends the elbow. The origin is the humeral lateral epicondyle, and the insertion is the olecranon process of the ulna. The abductor pollicis longus, the long abductor of the thumb. The origin is the ulna, posterior radius, and interosseous membrane. The insertion is the first metacarpal and trapezium. Next is the extensor pollicis longus on the right. This is the long extender of the thumb. The origin is the posterior ulna and interosseous membrane, and the insertion is the distal phalanx of the thumb. And then we have the extensor pollicis brevis, the short extender and abductor of the thumb. The origin is the posterior radius and interosseous membrane, and the insertion is the proximal phalanx of the thumb. And lastly is the extensor indicis, long extender of the index finger. The origin is the posterior ulna and interosseous membrane, and the insertion is the middle distal phalanges of finger 2. For muscles of the hand, the thenar eminence is all of these muscles here. The action of this is it opposes, flexes, and abducts the thumb. The hypothenar eminence are these muscles here, and they are the medial muscle of the palm used to control the fifth phalanx. The transverse carpal ligament is this guy here. This is where the thenar eminence and the hypothenar connect. And then the mid-palmar are the spaces in between the metacarpals, so all these lumbricals here. They connect to each knuckle and are responsible for flexing the metacarpophalangeal joints and extending the interphalangeal joints. The interossi, dorsi, and the palmar muscles for abducting and adducting the fingers.